Okay, one Nuto, 1 second. Just setting this all up quickly. You already know. Grab your blankets, your snacks, your tea, your everything. It's not loading on my phone. It never fails. Oh, bird. Share this around. Oh my god, phone. Sorry guys, I'm trying to pull up the stream on my phone. It's a potato. Who did the squawking? How dare in my household? Hey! That is highly inappropriate. You get your cloaca out of my face. That sounds bad out of context. Okay, so for context, each of our Griffons, I put it in the description, each of our Griffons are different. So me and Litch, we went with the Griffons from the last generation. So I went with Revas, who is the main character's Griffon, Asaya's Griffon. Litch went with Blacktalon, which Blacktalon's only really described as being probably a dark gray in coloration with black. And then LadyWolf here went with Rumptail, which is a Griffon from the new generation, which is in Dragon Age Veilguard, which this is the closest skin that we could get to Rumptail. If you are friends with her on Discord, you'll see her profile picture is Rumptail. And my profile picture is Asan, even though my Griffon right now is Revas. I just like Revas. Wow, we have 5 people watching. Okay. So, for those who don't know the Dragon Age lore, y'all are gonna be hella confused. I can explain it along the way, but this basically tells people what happened to the Griffons, why they went extinct back then, and all this other good stuff. Obviously in the background you will see these two flying after each other and chasing each other, causing mayhem. And Burrito will be joining us soon as well, so be on the lookout for that. But anyway, let me just lower the effects audio just a bit more, because it's loud in my ears. I don't know about you guys, but it's loud in mine. And, oh, they are chasing. And like I said, I'm only going to be reading Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. And this is going to be fun. This is going to be real fun. What the fuck? Okay, they're biting each other's assholes. Alright, moving on. Let's get with Chapter 1. Alright, Chapter 1. 941 Dragon, Weishaupt. Backed by the great ivory butte of Broken Tooth, the faraway fortress rose before Vala's awed eyes. Silver-fringed banners flapped from its towers, their emblems indistinct at this distance. But Valia, I can't pronounce her name. I can never pronounce Valia's name. Valia knew that they showed a steely gray griffin upon a field of blue. Beneath them stood a single gate of thick wood and steel. Brother Genitivi had written in his histories that it was wide enough for 3 horses to pass abreast, but from where Volya stood, it was so dwarfed by Weishaupt's stony bulk that it seemed tiny as her thumbnail. For weeks she dreamed of this place, ancient stronghold of the Grey Wardens, final resting place for the heroes of ages, first and last bulwark against the horrors of the Blights, and now her home too. The thought made her shiver with fearful delight. None of that excitement was reflected on her companions' faces. The fear was there, though, despite their best efforts to mask it. There were 4 of them besides Volya, an extraordinary number of recruits to be taken at once, she'd been told. They ranged in age from 16 to 19, except for senior enchanter Elphos, whose scraggly beard was more white than brown. All of them were mages, which was another extraordinary thing. By tradition, the wardens took only 1 recruit from each circle of magi in Heidas, but that tradition had been broken violently. Beginning in Kirkwall and spreading swiftly through Orlais, the mages of Heidas had found themselves hunted and hounded on all sides. The Templar Order, supposedly their protector and defender, had turned against them. How and why it had happened, Volya wasn't sure. She'd been only an apprentice until a few weeks ago, so no one had told her much of anything, and the rumors were impossibly confusing. What she did know was that Weishaupt and the Grey Wardens represented sanctuary. Elsewhere in Heidas, the world might have gone mad. Elsewhere, she'd been heard, entire circles of magi had been destroyed. Their towers had been pulled to the ground, and every mage and apprentice inside had been slaughtered, even the little children, for no crime beyond being born with the gift of magic. Other circles were said to have risen up in rebellion and joined an army of mages massing somewhere around Andorral's Reach. But that was elsewhere, not here. Here in the Anderfels, men and women remembered the true dangers of the world, and they did not waste precious lives fighting one another. When the first rumors reached their circle, the senior enchanter had sent a swift message to Weishaupt, and within days the warden's reply had come back. Any mage who wished to join the Grey Wardens was welcome. No such mage was to be troubled by the Templars. The warden's right of conscription was inviolate, and that meant its promise of sanctuary was too. Even so, few had chosen to accept the warden's invitation. Becoming a Grey Warden meant a hard life and a sure death, one way or another. It was a noble and ancient order, its tales sung by bards across Heidas, and no one, absolutely no one, save the truly heroic or the truly desperate, wanted to become a member. Volya wasn't sure which she was, but she knew she didn't want to die fighting Templars, and she knew the Grey Wardens, even more than the Circle of Magi, offered a place where an elf could stand equal to any human. Nowhere else in Heidas could give her that. So she had packed her few belongings and announced that she would accompany Senior Enchanter Elphos and a handful of other junior mages to Weishaupt, to become a Grey Warden or die trying. Now, under Broken Tooth's shadow, she could see the others regretting their decisions. It was as plain as the fear they tried so hard to hide. Templars were fanatics, but they were still men. They could be reasoned with, bullied, bribed. There would be none of that with Darkspawn, only a hard life and a sure death. Volya stepped forward, staring on the steep long road to Weishaupt's gates. It was late afternoon when they turned onto the path to Weishaupt, but it was fully dark by the time they reached its gates. Twice Elphos had called a halt for water and rest. Life in the Circle's tower, with all those endless spiraling stairs, had kept the senior enchanter reasonably fit for his age, but there was nothing in any circle of magi that approximated the road up Broken Tooth. 1,000 feet of vertical distance separated Weishaupt's gates from the dusty earth. The path that climbed up all that stone was at least 3 miles of hard switchbacks, punctuated by ancient carved steps, where the slope was too steep to run smooth. Each step had been worn down by the boots of countless Grey Wardens through the centuries, leaving shallow bowls that sent up little puffs of bone-colored dust as the mages' robes whisked across them. Narrow benches were carved into the stone at 2 wider points along the path, offering a Spartan respite, but otherwise there was no comfort to be had on the journey up, nor was there meant to be. The thin black slits of archers' windows stared down at them, pointedly foreboding, but they hardly needed to be there. Anyone who tried walking up the path under the sun's full glare would have been defeated by heat and wind long before coming into bowshot. Even in the coolness of twilight, the walk was punishing. At last, just when Volya thought her legs were about to give out and send her plummeting mercifully down the mountainside, they reached the final stretch of stairs. Above them the moon shone white in a cloudless sky. Below, the blasted land of the Anderfels stretched endlessly on in shades of gray and red. A smaller door, barely visible as a shadowed indentation in the massive wall, faced them. The senior enchanter rapped against it with the end of a staff, and after a moment it swung inward. A bluff-faced woman in a gray tunic and trousers stood inside. The sleeves of the tunic had been torn off, showing arms as muscular as a blacksmith's. An old injury had split her lip. It had healed with a flat white mark over her front teeth, and the teeth themselves were made of silver that glinted in the starlight. A spiked warhammer hung from a well-worn loop on her belt. "You'll be the Hosberg mages?" she said. Valya couldn't place her accent. Ferelden, maybe? She hadn't met many Fereldens. Senior Enchanter Elphas bowed his head graciously, despite his weariness. "We are." "Come in. I'll show you to your rooms. There'll be wash water if you want. And food. Rest for tonight. In the morning we could talk over what you'll be doing." "Of course," the Senior Enchanter said. "May I ask your name? I am Senior Enchanter Elphas of the Hosberg Circle, or I was. I suppose I don't know if I still am. My companions are Valya, Berith, Padin, and Seka. They are young, but all very good. We have come to offer our skills to your cause." "Sulwi," the silver-toothed woman said, "will make good use of your talents." She stepped back into the fortress, receding into darkness. Elphas lowered his staff, speaking a word, and the gem on its head began to glow softly. In a gentle parade of light, led by the radiant gem atop Elphas's staff, and carried on by the lesser magic of the students, the mages of Hosberg passed into Weishaupt. At daybreak, Sulwi returned and led Senior Enchanter Elphas away for a private conference. She didn't tell the others where they were going, and no one asked. A few minutes later, a handsome young elf knocked on their door. He wore the warden's blue and gray with casual arrogance, but his manner was far less intimidating than Sulwi's military correctness had been, and he seemed scarcely 5 years older than any of them. His hair was the color of rich honey, and it tumbled to his shoulders in loose curls. An easy smile warmed his face. He carried a large covered basket from which the tantalizing aroma of freshly baked bread wafted. Berith, shameless at 16, sat up straight on her cot and tugged her blouse lower. The elven warden seemed not to notice, except for a slight smile that teased at the corner of his mouth. He looked carefully away from the young mage as he set the basket down on a table. "Welcome to Weishaupt," he said. Valya happened to be sitting on the opposite side of the room as Berith, so the warden directed his greeting at her. "My name is Carol Nell." These names are stupid. "I'll be handling your initial assessments and introductory lessons. Also, your breakfast." He gestured to the basket. "Help yourselves. Bread and goat cheese. Plain fare, but good. We're not much for luxury here." "Thank you," Valya stammered, because someone had to say something. She felt a flush creeping up her cheeks. Caronel was unfairly handsome. To cover the redness, she stood up hastily and retrieved a chunk of bread from the basket, then passed the basket over to Seka. "What do you need to assess?" If Caronel noticed her blush, he showed no sign of it. He sat on the side of the Senior Enchanter's empty cot, turning so that he could see them all. "What you learned in Hosberg, what you know about the Darkspawn and the Wardens, and our duties in Heidas, how strong you are in your magic, whether you have any particular talents in the art, and whether you know anything that might be of use to us already." "That's a lot of questions," Valya murmured around a mouthful of bread. She swallowed with difficulty, glad to have an excuse for her dry mouth. "We have a lot of time," Caronel said with a wry smile. "Well, we have some time. Maybe not a lot. Let's start with the most crucial question. What do you know about Darkspawn? Have you ever fought any?" "I have," Seka said. He was a small gray boy with straight dark hair and enormous eyes that made him look far younger than his 16 years. "Before I came to the Circle, Hurlocks attacked our farm. We couldn't hold them off with arrows or pitchforks, so I burned them. That's how my magic came to me." Valya regarded her companion with surprise. She'd never heard that story before, and had no idea he'd survived such danger. Seka wasn't even a real mage yet, strictly speaking. He hadn't undergone the harrowing, which meant he was still an apprentice. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe there wouldn't be any more harrowings now that they were all apostates. Only Circle mages had to endure that awful ritual. Oh, hang on. I believe... Yep, my bad. 1 second. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Only Circle mages had to endure that awful ritual, and there were no circles anymore. In that case, maybe Seka was the most accomplished mage among them. Caronel certainly seemed to be impressed. The elven warden nodded at Seka with real respect. Then he glanced at the others. "And you?" Mutely, Valya shook her head along with the rest of them. She read about Darkspawn in the histories, of course, and heard countless stories from those who had fought the horrific creatures. No child of the Anderfels, elf or human, grew up without being terrorized by bedtime tales of Hurlocks and Glenlocks, and baby-eating ogres. But she had never personally laid eyes on one, much less faced a howling horde of them in combat. Then you'll have a lot to learn, Caranel said. If you become wardens, your primary duty will of course be protecting the people of Thedas from the depredations of Darkspawn. Not only will you have to fight against them personally, but you will have to lead others in that fight. You will need to know everything about them, their types, their tactics, and we all know about their origins and abilities. The elf paused. You're all mages, so I assume you can read. Volya nodded, as did her companions. Caranel gave them another approving glance. Very good. Then, until it's time for you to undergo the joining, you can earn your keep, and perhaps begin to learn something useful. In our libraries. Earn our keep how? Sekka asked. The Chamberlain of the Grey has requested your assistance with his research, Caranel said. You should be honored to assist. It's something to do with blood magic, I gather, although the Chamberlain's been being tight-lipped about the details. Old, whatever it is. But you mages love old books, don't you? You'd have a grand time with it. All that parchment and dust. Blood magic, Sekka echoed in a whisper, casting a nervous look to Volya. She shared the younger boy's unspoken sentiments. Oh god, I'm being harassed. Blood mages were feared and reviled across Thedas, for their magic drew upon pain and sacrifice, and could often be used to control the minds or bodies of others. If whatever this was involved Darkspawn too, Volya had never heard of Darkspawns possessing such magic. She had always thought they were mindless brutes, and blood magic required considerable sophistication. Something like that, Caranel said. You'll be looking for accounts where wardens acted strangely, disregarding their orders, abandoning their post, things of that nature. You'll also be looking for mentions of unusual Darkspawn, ones who could talk and think like men. These things may occur together or separately. It doesn't matter. Make note of both. Not everyone who witnessed such things would have recognized them for what they were, of course. The accounts may be cryptic and prone to exaggeration or disorientation. But any reference you could find would be helpful. I understand that it may be difficult to distinguish incidents where wardens inexplicably absconded from ordinary desertions or from outposts that were massacred during the fighting. I also understand that the language may present some difficulty, as you'll be focusing on materials that may be several centuries old. Do your best. When would you like us to begin? Volya asked. Today, Caranel replied. He stood, brushing invisible wrinkles from his deep blue tunic. As soon as you're done eating, in fact. The conversation died out after that. Volya, alight with nervous excitement, had to force herself to swallow her food. As hungry as she'd been before, the bread and cheese now seemed as flavorless as sawdust. When they finished eating, Caranel led them from their room down a long dusty hallway. To their right, the stone walls were hung with tapestries of plate-clad wardens mounted on griffins, and raining death down on armies of shrieking darkspawn. To the left, archers' slits allowed just enough sunlight to bring out the tapestries' faded hues. Weapons were mounted between some of the tapestries. They looked like darkspawn weapons, savagery crystallized in black, cruel, and clumsy, and terrifying. Old stains covered their blades. Blood, maybe? Or something worse. Volya couldn't tell. Shivering, she averted her eyes. You have to look, Sekka whispered by her elbow. The boy's eyes were fixed on a dented, bloodied shield. You have to bear witness and understand why it is so important to stop them. The joining, the calling. It's all worthwhile if it holds back the Darkspawn, once you understand what they are. Volya shook her head, her lips pressed tightly, but she looked up briefly at the ancient weapons nailed to the walls, and the tapestries that commemorated the grisly battles in which those weapons had presumably been taken. And then she cast her eyes downward, shivering again, and kept her gaze fixed on her own toes, as Caranel led them away through the hall and down a sweeping flight of stairs, and into Weishaupt's great library. It was an awe-inspiring sight, more of a cathedral than a library. Huge vaulted windows overlooked an adjacent courtyard and flooded the interlocking chambers with cloudy sunlight. Rows upon rows of gray stone shelves, all heavily laden with yellowing books and bone-encased scrolls. My phone. Bone-encased scrolls stretched for seemingly infinity in front of the mages. Chandeliers of scented candles hung from creaking iron frames overhead, filling the library with the mingled fragrance of beeswax, cider wood, and old smoke. The walls were richly carved with griffons and ancient coats of arms and ornamental plants, oranges, pomegranates, and plump, juicy grapes. All the fruits that the sculptor missed in the arid Enderfells, Volya guessed. You'll begin with the materials from the Fourth Blight, Caranel said, leading them to a smaller chamber that opened off the side of the main library. The older records are beyond most of us. If you made a study of ancient languages, we'd be glad to have you look at those, but I'm guessing that you haven't, in which case the chronicles from the Fourth Blight will be difficult enough. He stood beside the archway and waved them in. Leather-bound books in uniform rows covered the shelves that lined the chamber's upper halves. They had the look of official histories, recorded after the fact by scribes in quiet rooms. Underneath those neat gray tomes, enormous iron-bound trunks rested against the walls. 2 of them were open, revealing a clutter of books, papers, scraps of parchments, and other miscellaneous that appeared to have been loosely sorted by size, but was otherwise unorganized. The trunks contained primary materials, original reports, notes from the field, letters from wardens and soldiers. It's most likely that you'll find what we're looking for in there, Caranel said from the archway. Valya barely heard him. In the center of the room was a glass sarcophagus raised up on a dial of gilt white marble. At its head, a pair of enormous black horns spiraled up almost to the ceiling, their tips lost in the shadow. The sarcophagus was obviously very old, although slightly tinted. The panes of glass set into its walls and lid had been painstakingly cut to avoid bull's eyes, ripples, or other flaws in common older glass. The panes in the coffin were no bigger than Valya's palm, but each one was flawless. Feeling as though she'd fallen into some kind of trance, the young elven mage stepped through the archway and approached the sarcophagus. Through the lattice of glass and lead, she could see a suite of silverite plate mail gleaming faintly in the wan gray sunlight. It didn't look like... Oh my god, guys, what the fuck? Bye! Alright, let me lower this a bit more, because the Griffons are loud as shit. Okay, it's gonna be at a 2. There we go. Okay. It didn't look like the ceremonial armor. The warden's griffin was etched upon the breastplate, and there was some simple chase work on the helm and pauldrons, but it had the look of hard-used service mail. Old sweat stained the leather straps, and whoever had last polished the armor hadn't quite been able to get all the dents out. The armor's empty gauntlets were folded over 2 weapons, a long knife in a plain leather scabbard, and a graceful swooping longbow with a pair of gray and white feathers tied to its top end like a tassel. It was the sight of those melted feathers, brittled with age, that made Valya suck in a sudden breath of recognition. Those are Garahels. Garahel was the greatest elven hero that Heidas had ever known. As a Grey Warden, he had been crucial in rallying allies to fight the Fourth Blight, and he himself had struck down the archdemon Andorel, giving his own life to break the Darkspawn horde. Every elven child knew the story. Garahel occupied a special place of pride in their hearts. As an elf, he had suffered all the same indignities that they had, outcast, spat upon, considered utterly beneath respect. He had nevertheless risen above the contentment, and had not only forgiven his old enemies, but had spared them from sure doom. Alone, he had ended the Fourth Blight and saved Heidas. Valya passed her fingers reverently over the coffin's glass facets. She didn't dare touch them. Leaving smudges on Garahel's memorial would have been impious. But even that light brush sent a thrilling tingle through her skin. The hero of the Fourth Blight. The other mages had filtered into the room behind her. They too looked at the coffin with its crown of rigid black horns. Their expressions shifted from confusion to awe, as each of them came to the silent realization of whose arms and armor lay in the glass casket, and whose horns those were standing like a headstone above his memorial. Behind them, Caranel smiled. "We keep relics from all the blights here. This isn't just a library. It is a monument to honor the fallen." He stepped away, taking his hand from the arch. "Call out if you need anything. There are always wardens in the library, and the Chamberlain's office is nearby. There is a washroom near the back on the right, behind the case of ogre horns. I'll be back to summon you for dinner." Then he was gone, and the 4 of them were alone with the books and the trunks and the archdemon's horns. "Do you think those are really Garahel's arms?" Padine whispered. She was the oldest of them, and the tallest. A gawky blonde girl with pock-scarred cheeks, and a habit of hunching her shoulders inward in a futile attempt to make herself small. "Of course they are," Valya said. "The wardens wouldn't have fakes." "Where do you want to begin?" Seka asked. "With the official histories, or the trunks?" Valya hesitated. She knew very little about the real history of the Fourth Blight. Garahel's heroism was a familiar tale, and she heard old songs sung like The Rat-Eater's Lament and The Orphan with Five Fathers, which dated from the infamous siege of Haussburg, but the details of troop movements and battles were a mystery to her. The Fourth Blight had lasted more than a decade, hadn't it? That was an enormous span of fighting. Where should they begin looking for traces of abnormal darkspawn, or wardens who had absconded from their duties? We'll start with the battle maps, she decided. We might be able to tell something from the warden's troops' movements. A picture's supposed to be worth 1,000 words, isn't it? If you know how to read it, Berith muttered. The pretty blonde still seemed to be sulking after Caranel had ignored her. No one else protested, though. Padine lifted the oversized book containing the official versions of the warden's battle maps and began leafing carefully through the pages. The book was very old, but it had been designed to withstand the march of ages and had been reinforced with spells for that purpose, and the colored lines denoting rivers and forests on the tough beige parchment were as bright as the day they'd been drawn. Almost from the start, the darkspawn hordes overwhelmed the maps. Their forces were rendered as simple black sigils, menacing in their starkness. They marched on, swallowing kingdoms, erasing the names of villages and towns and cities under their onslaught. But the uniformity of the markings told Valia nothing about which darkspawn they'd been, or how they'd affect their conquest. She turned her attention to the warden's movements instead. Perhaps it would be easier to divine a pattern in their responses to the horde. Unlike the darkspawn, the wardens were not all marked with the same map symbol. The Griffons were designated with a stylized eagle's head, sometimes rendered in blue and sometimes in red. She supposed those were the forces headed by two different commanders. Cavalry were horses' heads, again in varying colors, and infantry were marked by spear points. Little pennons sketched under the spears designated whether they were wardens or allies from various nations. But there wasn't much of a pattern of those either, at least none she could tell from looking at the maps without context. Gradually, the other mages reached the same conclusion and drifted away, opening trunks and beginning to sift through the primary documents. Valia stuck doggedly to the maps. She wanted to at least get the end of the book before giving up and trying another tack. A note in the margin of one map caught her eye. At first glance, it looked just like another town or village, somewhere outside Starkhaven, right on the same edge of the Darkspawn horde, and doubtlessly soon destroyed by the same. Nothing noteworthy. But the name was the Elvish word for griffin, which seemed an unlikely choice for a human village, and there was a subtle shimmer of dust rubbed into the parchment underneath it. Lyrium. It was only a tiny amount, and very dilute, but after years of apprenticeship in the circle of magi, Valia recognized lyrium dust immediately. There we go. That green-blue glow, constant through the world of the living and the fate alike, was utterly unique in Heidas. She glanced over her shoulder. No one was paying her any mind. They were all immersed in searching through their own letters and journals. Cautiously but curiously, Valia drew a thread of mana from the fade and tried to view the map through the shifting lens of magic. The pale blue agate in her staff gleamed, just faintly. She could pass it off as reflected sunlight if anyone looked her way. No one did, though, and when Valia glanced down at the map, she was very glad for that. A single line of elvish script shimmered on the map, glowing pale blue as magic flowed through the lyrium-laced ink in which it had been written. Lathbora Viran. Valia released her hold on the fade as soon as she saw the words. They faded back invisibly into the parchment, but they stayed bright in her mind. Lathbora Viran. The spelling was archaic, as were the forms of the letters, but she understood the words all the same. There was no exact translation into any human tongue, so far as Valia knew, although the phrase could be clumsily reduced to the path to a place of lost love. It was a quote from one of the few great poems to be remembered through the oral traditions of the Dalish and the alienages, and it described a wistful wish for beauty that one had never actually experienced in life. It was sweet. It was a sweetly painful sensation, akin to nostalgia, but laced with greater bitterness. For a nostalgic man remembers the pleasure he has lost, whereas one experiencing Lathbora Viran longs for a thing that he can never really know. Under the blackberry vines, I felt it, Valia muttered under her breath. That was how the poem opened, with the musky fragrance of ripening blackberries, bitter and sweet, and a wish to remember the lost-long sense of Arlathan. The poem itself was Lathbora Viran, because no elf she'd ever met remembered it in the original Elvish. The elves had a few fragmented words and the skeleton of the history of the story, but the poem itself had been haltingly recreated in human tongue. No alienage elves knew enough of their history or mother language to recall their civilization's lost words of art. They didn't even know the original title. Under the Blackberry Vines, it was called, because no one knew the true name anymore. It was a strange thing to find on a war map from the Fourth Blight. There was no question in Volya's mind that the lyrium lace message was contemporaneous with the map's original drawing. Indeed, the spell that hid it from casual view might have been woven into the same enchantment that preserved the map's more obvious markings. But why? Why would someone conceal a snippet of poetry so that it could be found only by a mage and understood only by an elf? Unless it wasn't just a line of fanciful nostalgia. Had there been blackberry vines among the carvings in the other room? Volya went back to find out. The main library was mostly empty, with just one gray-haired warden looking through the windows at birds singing in the inner courtyard. Volya moved quietly around him to examine the carvings of fruits upon the walls. They were as she remembered: figs, pomegranates, citrus fruits, and one solitary blackberry vine, with broad-petaled flowers blooming alongside tight buds and lush berries. The carved vine encircled a torch scone tucked away between two shelves, then trailed down to a gray stone bench built into the wall. Volya peered under the scone. Nothing stood out to her there. Under the bench, however, there was another faint shimmer of lyrium dust, rubbed into one of the stones in the walls. This time it was so light she would have never seen it if she hadn't already been holding on to the fade. With another backward glance to ensure that no one was looking, she touched the fade again and channeled a second wisp of magic into the stone. It vibrated as her magic touched the lyrium-rubbed rock, and the block shifted outward an inch. Tense with nervous anticipation, Volya gripped the sides of the block with her fingertips and awkwardly wiggled it loose. When it was almost out, she eased it down to the floor carefully, and exhaled in quiet relief at how little sound it made. Behind the loose block was a little hole in the wall, and in that hole was a single book, small but thick. Its cover was scuffed and blood-stained, and its pages were warped with old moisture, but it seemed to be in good condition. Biting her lip, Volya pulled it out, and then she carefully replaced the stone block and sat on the bench as though nothing at all were amiss. She opened the book, unsure what to expect. It was filled with script in a fast, careless hand, feminine, but not soft in the slightest. In the year 512 exhausted, it began. My brother Garahel and I flew to Antiva City. And I'm going to take a quick break to get a drink, and then we will go to chapter 2, which, yeah, that's going to be a long chapter as well. My throat already is killing me, so that's why I'm taking a quick break. But like I said, just quick break time. Enjoy the Griffons. And I swear to God, if I end up looking up and I see one of you snoofing the camera, I'm going to scream. Okay, I am back. What the fuck is happening? What? No! Ah! Ah! What? Ah! I'm so scared. Okay. I, oh god, there's so many fluff butts. Guys, oh god. There's so much going on. Oh my god. Okay, they're biting each other. Okay, I'm just gonna vibe over here. Okay. I got my cup of milk. Alright, let's get to the second chapter. Chapter 2, 512 Exalted. The second time Asaya climbed into a griffin saddle, she was riding to join a war. Neither she nor her brother, Garahel, were anywhere near ready for it. Greener than seasick frogs, their lieutenant had called them, and he'd been right. The two of them had become Grey Wardens scarcely a year before, and they had been assigned to the Red Wing of the Griffin Riders only 4 months earlier. They were still practicing on horses with big wooden boards on their saddles to mimic the obstruction of Griffin's wings. Only ones strapped into back saddles with more experienced wardens at the reins had either Garahel or Isaiah ever flown. That was merely to test to see whether either of the young elves suffered from crippling vertigo or fear that would make further training a waste. Under normal circumstances, they wouldn't have seen aerial combat for another year. But the blight waited for no one. 4 months earlier, Darkspawn had come pouring out of the north, answering the call of a newly awakened old god. They boiled up from the depths of the earth, using the ancient dwarven deep roads to travel unseen by human eyes. Caught by surprise, the nations of Heidas had been wholly unable to mount an effective defense against the Darkspawn hordes. Antiva, which had come under attack first, had lost ground as fast as the monstrous army could claim it. The scattered militias of the towns and villages in its outlying lands were no obstacles to the Darkspawn. Their walls were smashed and trodden underfoot, their citizens slaughtered or carried down to the deep roads to meet a worse fate. The river city of Selene, fabled for its graceful bridges and sculptures, had fallen after a siege that lasted only 4 days. For weeks afterward, the river had been fouled with corpses. The people of Antiva City had watched them float by, spinning out to sea, day after day, and with each bloated body their fear had grown. In the desperate straits, there was no time to finish the young warden's training, and as Isaiah flew into Antiva City, clinging to the back of the senior warden ahead of her, and squinting against the whipping wind, she understood just how dire the capital city situation was. Antiva City sat on the edge of a shimmering blue bay. Rich green farmland and orchards surrounded it in a 10-mile belt inland, stretching farther along the shores of the river that ran to the ruins of Selene. Beyond that fringe of fertility, the blight had swallowed Antiva. The corruption that flowed through the Darkspawn had poisoned the land under their march. Even from 1,000 yards in the sky, Isaiah could see that the earth was barren and twisted, where the horde had passed. Above it, the sky roiled with clouded black clouds. Leafless trees stood like skeletal sentinels over shrunken creeks, which ran low in their banks as though the earth itself were drinking them dry. Fields of grain lay withered and rotted, with nary a green patch to be seen amid their curling gray stalks. The few animals she saw were mostly crows and vultures, their hunched bodies scabby and featherless from the blight disease they contracted while feeding on Darkspawn corpses. The Darkspawn army itself was a blur of black mail and tattered banners. Isaiah barely saw anything of them. While the Darkspawn themselves could not fly, other than the archdemon, which as of yet few had seen, their arrows and spells could reach some distance into the air, and so the Griffons climbed high to avoid them. Clouds sheared off the sight of the Hurlocks and Genlocks, massed around their emissaries and ogres, and for that Isaiah was quietly grateful. Past the army, they descended again, for the air above the clouds was too thin and cold to hold the Griffons for long. Isaiah saw no people in the blighted lands as they crossed over Antiva. They were dead, fled or in hiding. There were hundreds camped outside the gates of Antiva City, though, refugees clad in rags and desperation, living in wagons and crude makeshift shelters, eating whatever they could find. Their stench was overwhelming. The city gates were closed to them, and had been since news of the blight reached the capital, but they had nowhere else to go. They can't go on like this, the elf whispered into her companion's back. She hadn't expected her words to carry over the rush of the wind and the griffin's wings, but somehow the senior warden heard her. His name was Hubble, or Hubble. Yeah, probably Hubble. And Asaya didn't know him well. He was a grizzled old veteran, survivor of countless skirmishes against Herlocks and Genlocks, and he spent most of his time raging far afield of Weishaupt on the back of his griffin, Blacktalon. He was not one to frighten easily, but his face was grim when he turned in the saddle to answer her. "No, they can't," he said and returned to guiding the griffin. A few minutes later they were circling over Antiva City, holding the loose wind-whipped ends of her hair back with one hand. Asaya craned to look down between Blacktalon's sweeping wings. She read about the glories of Antiva City many times, but had never seen them herself. The port city was said to be a glittering gem, and from the air that was true. The blight had not yet touched the capital. The boulevard of the seas was still strikingly beautiful, its turquoise and sea-green tiles bright against the white marble of the main road. The golden plaza still threw sparks of fiery sunlight from the dozens of gilded statues that adorned its broad expanse, and the royal palace remained a sight of breathtaking grandeur, its slender towers and stained-glass windows set alight by the sinking sun. But there weren't as many ships in the harbor as Asaya had expected. There were some royal warships, and a scattering of smaller vessels painted with the Antivan golden drake, but few merchant craft of any kind. She guessed that most of them had fled to safer shores, bearing as many passengers as could pay whatever exorbitant fees their captain cared to charge. Even the little fishing boats seemed to be missing. There weren't many citizens abroad on those beautifully streets either. The markets were sparsely populated, the stalls mostly bare. Although the danger had not yet reached their gates, Antiva's people seemed to have hunkered down in their homes, bracing themselves against the storm they knew must come. Then they were descending past the palace's curtained walls, and Asaya's view of the city was cut off by high sheets of stone. The palace courtyard was a maelstrom of dust. 24 griffins had been assigned to the royal palace, along with an equal number of Grey Wardens. And the clamor and chaos of their arrival overwhelmed the castle servants. The griffins were particularly difficult. The great beasts were territorial and short-tempered at the best of times, and the long flight had made them especially irritable. Several of them had flown up to the curtain wall, where they beat their wings and shrieked at anyone who came near. The Antivans gave the griffins a wide berth, as they brought bread and wine to the wardens, and Asaya couldn't blame them. She'd been working closely with the animals for months, grooming them and feeding them, and learning to read their ever-changing moods, and she was still routinely intimidated by the winged predators. An adult griffin could grow to be more than 12 feet from beak to tail, with a wingspan even greater. The males weighed more than 2,000 pounds. The females only slightly less. Their beaks were powerful enough to snap an elk's thigh bone effortlessly. Their claws could shred plate mail like damp paper. Although the Grey Wardens tended to select their smaller and lighter members as griffin riders, enabling the beasts to service steeds longer and under harsher conditions, a healthy griffin was fully capable of fighting with 2 men in full armor on its back. They were fierce, fearless predators full of wild beauty and quicksilver rage. Asaya loved them. She loved their power and their grace and their musky leonine smell. She loved the way their bright gold eyes would close halfway when they were pleased with her grooming, and the earth-shaking rumble that passed for their purrs. And she loved the sheer, unfettered freedom they had in the air, and the extraordinary gift of flight that they could share with their riders when they chose, because a griffin always chose. One could not compel the great beast to carry riders they did not want. A griffin would sooner hurl itself into a mountainside than it would accept servitude to a master it disliked. They were never servants, never slaves. A griffin was a partner, an equal, or else it was a foe. That was why training a new griffin rider took so long, and why Asaya didn't fault the Antivans for being wary of their huge feathered guest. A griffin was nothing like a dog or a horse, or even one of the spotted hunting cats that some Orlesian nobles were said to keep on jeweled leashes. They were proud and jealous and wild, and a wise man never forgot that. The warden certainly hadn't. They helped the servants set out wash tubs of water for the griffins, tasked one of the senior wardens to watch over the beasts, and filed into the castle. The griffins would be fed later, separately. Offering them meat while they were crowded together was too likely to start fights. Asaya hoped no well-meaning servant tempted them, but it wasn't her duty to watch the griffins this evening. She followed the others into the palace's shade, falling in alongside her brother. Garahel shook dust out of his golden hair as he walked. He already washed his face, probably sneaking a few handfuls of the Griffons' drinking water to do it. Isaiah hid a smile. Her brother could be unutterably vain, but, she had to admit, not without reason. Elves were widely accounted to be more beautiful than humans, but even by that measure, Garahel was exceptional. High cheekbones, brilliant green eyes, and a smile that made ladies, and not a few men, go weak in the knees. He was far better looking than she was, and frankly, Isaiah was glad. Beauty was a poisoned blessing for an elven woman in Heidas. Her brother wasn't smiling today, though. No one was. If the mood in Antiva City had been grim, the mood in the royal palace was positively sepulchre. Ooh. Hubal led them through the palace's defense outer walls and its ornamental inner ones. The servants pressed against the walls as the Grey Wardens went past, watching them go with flickering, fearful hope in their eyes. The palace guards, all dressed in ceremonial mail, with Antiva's golden drake standing proud on their surcoats, gave them brisk nods and stood aside respectfully at each door. Although Hubal set a quick pace, it seemed to take forever to reach their audience. Isaiah had always thought that Weishaupt's fortress must be the largest building in the world, but Antiva's royal palace came close. And, sorry, I just see you guys in the background just flying around, sorry. I got distracted. Okay, must be close. Finally, after crossing an interior garden filled with climbing roses in a dozen perfume shades of red and yellow, they came to the small hall where the king and queen awaited. Warden Commander Turab, the stout red-bearded dwarf who served as leader of the Grey Wardens in Antiva, was with them, as were 20 Antivan wardens and a small knot of richly dressed men and women who Isaiah took to be high-ranking nobles. Hubal, the warden commander said, inclining his head in gruff greeting. No trouble getting here, I hope. Not much, Hubal said. He bowed formally to the king and queen. The Antivan royals responded with measured nods. King Eladio was in his mid-40s, Isaiah guessed. He was a kind-looking but timid man who hesitated visibly before every movement. His queen, Giovanna, looked slightly older. Broad bands of gray streaked the rich chestnut of her hair, and smile lines softened the hard planes of her face. Theirs was said to be the rare royal marriage that was founded on love, Isaiah recalled. The queen had been born to a wealthy and honorable merchant house, but her blood was scandalously low by the standards of Antiva's court. Nonetheless, King Eladio had chosen her as his bride, and over the decades their union had won the approval of their people. It helped, no doubt, that Queen Giovanna was a devoted patron of the arts, and had invested much of her considerable fortune into the beautification of the capital city. Her influence had made Antiva a center for art and culture in Heidas, rivaling the greatest cities of Orlais and the waning Tevinter Imperium. "You have come to help us defend our city?" the queen asked. She did not speak loudly, but so hushed was the hall that her words reverberated through the audience. To save Antiva in her hour of need? It was hard to turn down that quiet, dignified plea, but clearly the Grey Wardens meant to do just that. Hubal and Turab exchanged looks, and then the human warden shook his head. "No, your highness." A frown shadowed the queen's brow. "No? So much will be lost if the city falls. Sculpture, music, arts, our libraries, our mosaics. Not only the works themselves, but the knowledge that created them. You cannot mean for us to abandon the legacies of so many lifetimes." "Antiva City cannot be defended," Hubal said evenly, dividing his attention between the two royals. "Not for any real length of time. A few days, a few weeks if we're lucky. No more. You didn't have enough warning to prepare. The Darkspawn tore through Antiva too quickly. The city doesn't have enough food stored, enough soldiers trained, or enough weapons and armor to equip them. The sea will help, some, but the Darkspawn will come over the walls long before they try to starve us all out." "Our walls are very strong," King Eladio offered tentatively. "Yes, your highness," Turab agreed, with as much gentleness as the brusque dwarf could muster. Isaiah could see that he had grown fond of those people, and did not relish shattering their hopes. "That is what might give us those weeks." "Then there is nothing you could do?" the queen asked. Disbelief crept into her melodious voice, making it thin and brittle. "How can the Grey Wardens accept defeat so casually? The singers make you out to be such legends, but you want us to surrender our entire city, our entire country, before the first blow has been struck?" "A city pinned against the sea with all its hinterlands seized by Darkspawn," Hubal said. Impatience and anger had crept into his voice, although his face remained frozen in a respectful mask. "Have you looked at Antiva City on the map? You get no reinforcements and no resupply. The rest of the country will already be overrun by the time the Horde comes to your walls. The Darkspawn don't have siege engines, it's true, but they don't need them. The ogres will herd genlocks over your walls to crash down on your people. Whether the genlocks survive their impact hardly matters. Once enough of them have come down, they'll spread the blight disease, and that'll be the end of Antiva City. And that presumes the archdemon doesn't come. If it does, you won't even have days. The royals had gone pale. Asaya sneaked a glance back at the knot of Antivan nobles. They, too, looked deathly frightened. She felt more than a little of that fear herself. It had been 200 years since the last blight had touched Heidas, long enough for tales of Toth and Hunterfell to fade into children's stories. Now the monsters had come out from under their beds, and their claws were sharp indeed. I asked Hubel to bring a force of wardens so that we'd have a chance to evacuate the city, Turab said with the same dogged patience. You'll still have enough ships to take your people into Relado Bay. They can find refuge on some of the larger islands. Darkspawn can't swim and don't have ships, so you and your people will be safe there. King Eladio closed his eyes for a minute as he tried to run through the numbers. We'll be lucky to save a third of them. You won't save any if you stand and fight, Turab said. Your Highness, these wardens came here willingly to lay down their lives to save your people, but they need you to lead them to safety. I'll think on it, the king said quietly. He raised his hands and put the palms together in a soundless clap, signifying that their audience was at an end. Warden Commander Turab and Hubel bowed to the royals, along with the rest of the wardens. Asaya mimicked the gesture, then followed their leaders out of the hall. They really wanted us to defend their city, Girahel murmured to her as they were passing through the rose garden again, for the sake of some paintings and fountains. The flower's sweetness was lost to Asaya, and the sun on her skin left her cold. She couldn't stop thinking about all those people huddled outside the city gates, hoping desperately for a salvation that would be close to them, and the people inside the gates, equally desperate, who might lose theirs if the king and queen clung too long to their impossible hopes of beating back a siege. Of course they did, she whispered back to her brother. They're people. They want hope. We gave them hope, Girahel replied. We gave them all the hope the world is going to allow, and they won't take it because they want more. Asaya shook her head unhappily, unable to articulate her sorrow. As they left the garden and passed back into the relative cool of the palace's interior halls, she shivered. The sun hadn't warmed her in the slightest, but the shadow seemed unbearable. Turab took them down to one of the guard barracks. It had been cleared for the warden's arrival. Even with the blight on the city's doorstep, the palace servants had taken the time to lay out clean blankets on the cots and hang bundles of dried lavender from the walls. The peppery sweet fragrance of those tiny purple flowers was painful to Asaya. The Darkspawn had no concept of beauty, no use for the small civilized gestures that made the world a bit more pleasant place. They just killed and destroyed and poisoned, and where they passed, no lavender would ever grow again. She sat heavily on the side of a cot, fingering the rough woolen blanket that some servant had washed and folded for her. Probably they'd chosen their best blankets out of gratitude for the wardens coming to rescue Antiva. We have to save them, she mumbled, but she said it very quietly, and to no one in particular, and if anyone heard, they did not answer. Alright, so next chapter is also going to be in Asaya's point of view again. Oh my god, what the hell is happening on my screen? I'm not going to look at my screen anymore. I'm scared. So the next chapter, chapter 3, is going to be in Asaya's point of view. Chapter 4 is where it gets interesting, because that's when the Griffons come in, more so. So next time I'm going to be reading chapter 3 and chapter 4. However, the next book set will be Godzilla x Kong once more. They're biting each other. I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope you all enjoyed the reading. Once again, I apologize for any words that I have misread. Oh, Jesus Christ. I apologize for any words that I have misread. My brain works faster than my mouth. So, I will see you all. I will see you all later. I will see you all later. Until next time.